So ever since I did my video that you can see up here, High-End Security Equipment and Philosophy, where I spoke at length about how it's more important that we know how to speak to people than what equipment we have or how cool our uniform looks, people have been asking me to do videos about speaking to people on the street as a police officer and speaking to people on the street as a security guard. There's two different issues to understand with speaking to people on the street as a police officer. There's the art of it and the science of it. And you have to understand the science before you can really get into the art and understand that. So today we're going to look at the very beginnings of the science of speaking to people on the security as a police officer. Alright, man, take a seat. Quick look. We'd start with orientation of the car here, but we got calls pending and we got to get to them. So, we're rolling. We're going to have to learn on the way. Alright, so the two metrics we're going to talk about today in relationship to speaking to people on the street as a police officer, as a security guard, is attitude and education. And these are two very separate things, and there's a lot of overlap between them often, but the problem is that people often confuse these as being one and the same. So we're going to look at education. We're going to look at a person who has a doctorate level education, those people that go to school and get $200,000 in debt to put a D and an R in front of their name or PhD at the end. And then Uncle Rufus, who sits on the front porch picking a banjo, who does nothing but get drunk all day and never graduated the 6th grade. And then over on the attitude side, we're going to look at Rambo up at the top, who has very few interpersonal skills and is highly aggressive. And then the Walmart greeter at the bottom, the kindly person who wants nothing but to be your friend. So let's start off with education. I recently took a class where the instructor suggested that we speak to everyone as though they have a 4th grade education. Now here's the problem with doing that. When we speak to people as though they have a 4th grade education, that they're all the way down here at the dumbest level of the education spectrum for adults in the United States, what we're going to do is this person, Uncle Rufus down here, might not be upset at all that we're speaking to him like that. He's probably used to being spoken to like that, but we are going to upset the people who are doctors or who are very intelligent people who are just going to think that we have mistaken them for an idiot. Now, the argument that instructor made at the time was that if we speak to people at too high a grade level, if we use words that are too large for them or compound sentences that are too compound for them, they won't be able to understand what we're saying. Now, here's my contention. If we start speaking to someone as though they have a doctorate level education or they're a lawyer, if we speak to someone about criminal matters as though they are a lawyer, they're another police officer, they are a doctor at a hospital or a nurse or someone with a pretty high level of education who is going to understand what we're talking about, and in fact we're talking to Uncle Rufus down here who never graduated the 6th grade, it's very easy for Uncle Rufus to ask us questions, and it's easier for us to figure out Uncle Rufus isn't understanding what we're talking about, and then we can dumb down our words, and we can dumb down the way we're saying something. It's a lot easier to start off saying, all right, well, what you're going to have to do is come into the station and get a packet for an order of protection. You're going to have to take it over to the courthouse and see if you can talk to the state's attorney's office and get a warrant issued for that person's arrest. If we tell someone that, and they are a highly intelligent person, they've been in the criminal justice system before, or they understand the law, they're going to be able to easily say, okay, well, that makes sense, and we don't assume they're an idiot. We're not upsetting that person by assuming that they don't know what we're talking about. If you tell someone that they have to come in and get a warrant packet and go to the courthouse and try to get an order of protection or a warrant against that person, and it's Uncle Rufus and he goes, what? We can say, okay, you have to come over to this address. Let me write it down for you. Over here, do you have Google on your phone? Okay, that's cool. All right, I'm going to write this address down. You come up to the police station with this little card, and you're going to talk to a detective up at the front desk, and they are going to look over the report, and they're going to give you some paperwork. You have to take that packet of paperwork over to this other address, yada, 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 yada. If we start off with the person assuming that they have a 4th grade education level, and it turns out that they are a doctor or a lawyer or someone with a high level of education, someone who reads a lot, someone that's very into the law, they are going to think that we're assuming that they're an idiot. And we have to understand that anytime we're talking to someone on the street, what we're trying to do is either educate them about the process, give them advice for something, or gain voluntary compliance. And for all of those things, what we want to do is we want to get this person on board with the process that we're trying to describe to them, or get this person on board with how we want to get things done so that we can get our job done and get on with the rest of our life or go on to our next call. If we upset that person by assuming that they are at a 4th grade education level and that they're not going to understand what we're saying, we're not going to get that same type of voluntary compliance. And in fact, if we speak to someone in that manner, they're going to think that we are speaking in a condescending way to them, or they're going to think that we are an idiot, and neither of those is good for us. Either they're going to assume that we are dumb, or they're going to assume that we think they're dumb, depending on how we say that. And that brings us on to attitude. There's an old saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts looking like a nail. And the problem is that we get a lot of guys who think this is the only way to accomplish the task. They show up on scene, whoa, I'm in charge, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen, and then when they meet resistance to that, then they try to go down to being the Walmart greeter and wanting to be everybody's friend, because they've learned over the years that this is just the easier way to accomplish their task. And if your only task is clearing that call as quickly as possible, then yeah, I guess that's a viable method, but it's not a method that I would suggest. If we start off at the Walmart greeter mode on every scene, then we have the opposite problem. We have a situation where something needs to be taken care of. It needs to happen immediately so nobody gets hurt or gets hurt any worse than they are. And we can gain control of the situation. And what we have is someone that's saying sir and ma'am, and maybe saying sir and ma'am louder, but not really getting anywhere. So we have to select our attitude level that we're using based upon the totality of the circumstances that we're seeing on the scene. But there's one thing that we need to think about when we're selecting it, so that way we have a better chance of getting a positive outcome to the call. And that is that it is always easier to ratchet up our attitude than it is to bring it back down. If we come on scene and we immediately start off in Rambo mode, it is very hard to then be somebody's friend a couple minutes later and get voluntary compliance out of them. Could it be done? Sure, it could be done, but it's a lot easier if we start at the lowest end of the scale that we think is going to work, and then we can push up from there when we have an issue. Now, people very often jump to Rambo mode when they show up on a domestic and there's two people screaming and yelling at each other, and they get between them and start screaming back at them and fighting with them, and that is actually the topic of our next video on this series, is dealing with two people who are arguing and applying the education versus attitude issues going on here to what we're doing on an actual call. If you like this type of content and the message it sends about law enforcement and reasonableness, check out the Patreon page. Throw $1 over there. Every little bit helps me do things like get kind of a little quasi-studio in my garage where I can try to explain things a little better in the abstract. And it helps me upgrade my equipment, so maybe one day the audio will be a little bit better. Until next week, you guys be safe and take care of each other. I'd like to thank all the Patreon supporters, and especially the shift supervisor level Patreon supporters that we have listed here. Your contributions are what allows free field training to continue on and become better. Thank you. Well, if you like that video, go ahead and subscribe, because there's a whole lot more to come. As soon as I finish up these calls, go 10-8. County 291.